I really liked the video that Wesley and Christian collaborated on and put together for us this morning. Um, they did that quite independently of me, and I I think that worked out really well. Um, because the way they put that together with a series of questions, I think that's a good way to get us to think and explore. And I want us to take a little bit of time to think and explore this passage. It kind of falls into two neat parts. The first part is where Jesus is asking this question, ends up having a conversation specifically with Peter about Peter's response. We've got that part. And then the second part really starts in verse 34, where it says he calls together more of his disciples, other people, and it's a teaching. And he says the things there about taking up the cross, about denying oneself, about what about gaining the world. So I want us to look a little bit at both sections, but I want to concentrate more on the second part, the teaching, and what that might mean. I think Wesley raised some really good questions in the video. So the first part, Jesus asks, who do people say that I am? Peter ends up giving a correct answer, but Peter doesn't know what it means for Jesus to be the Christ. Sometimes we get all puzzled. Why does Jesus say, don't tell anyone? It's because Peter doesn't know what to tell them apart from saying he's the Messiah. Peter doesn't know what that means. And if he tries to say, oh, he's the Messiah and tell them something, he'll get it wrong. We know that. Not Peter's fault. We know he'll get it wrong because immediately after Peter makes that statement, Jesus says, don't tell anyone, he starts to explain what it means for him to be the Messiah. It means that he has come to show the love of God to the degree that it costs him everything. That's what the cross is. The cross is, to me, not God's plan for Jesus to die. It's God's plan for Jesus to love to the point of death. And there's a very big difference between those two statements. God's plan for Jesus is come love these human beings that we have made no matter what, so as to communicate the extent of my love, which is what Jesus does. But see, Peter doesn't understand that. He can say, you're the anointed one, you're the Christ, you're the Messiah. That's what the term means, anointed one. But he doesn't know to say, oh, and that means he's going to suffer and show the love of God in the most unbelievable way. Because Peter doesn't know that, he can't go ahead and tell people this is the Christ. As Paul puts it very succinctly in 1 Corinthians chapter 2, he says, we preach Christ and him crucified. You can't preach Christ without the cross, or you're saying nothing of real value about who the Christ is. So that's why Jesus says, don't tell anyone. And he immediately starts to instruct them about his coming death so that they would know what it means for him to be the Christ. And of course, we have Peter's response is because he doesn't understand the meaning of being the Messiah. He wants to tell Jesus, no, that's not what needs to happen. And Jesus responds and says, get behind me, Satan. Mentioned before that couple things about that. One is you can tell the satanic because it wants to distort what God is doing. It wants to take the ways of God and just alter them. That's kind of the subtle way in which the demonic works. And that potential rests within each one of us. I can easily twist the things of God. The good things of God, I can mess up really easily. So the potential for the demonic resides in me. And of course, that's what Peter's doing. He wants to say, no, don't follow that path. It sounds very much like the temptations of Jesus in the wilderness, doesn't it? Oh, there's another way to all the kingdoms of the earth. There's a way you can get there that's not this way. So Jesus says, get behind me, Satan. He identifies that as the satanic. And then the point about get behind me is follow me. It's not leave me, get out of here, I don't want you around. It's get behind me. You're out in front trying to tell me what to do. Get back behind me and follow me and you'll learn. Be my disciple, Peter. So he's not rejecting Peter. He's telling him his proper place. be a follower, be a learner. So that brings us down to the point where Jesus then starts in verse 34. My translation says he summoned the crowd with his disciples. So now he gathers more people together and he wants to teach something. And he mentions about 4 different things, and they are difficult to understand. If you try to understand them literally, they will make no sense. We obviously don't do them literally. When Jesus says, take up your cross, I don't think any of us are carrying around some sort of wooden cross of any appreciable size. So we don't take that literally. But even when he says something like, what would it profit someone if they were to gain the whole world? My question is, can you gain the whole world? Is that even a possibility? I don't think you can. There's no way you can gain the whole world. So Jesus is not speaking literally. He must be speaking in a fashion of hyperbole. Just kind of saying, imagine if it were possible to get everything, absolutely everything, for you to be emperor of the universe. Would that be worth losing your own soul? In other words, the essence of who you are. So these are not to be understood literally, but how should we understand them? So he's got 4 of them. He's got the one about, in verse 34, deny oneself and take up the cross and follow. The second one in 35 is, if you wish to save your life, you must lose it. But if you lose your life for my sake and the gospel's, you will save it. The third one is the one about, what does it profit a man to gain the whole world if he forfeits his soul? And what will man give in exchange for his soul? And then the fourth one, this business of, if you're ashamed of me, I'll be ashamed of you. So what do we make of all those 4? My sense is, because the first one talks about taking up the cross, that they're all speaking about how we are to imitate Christ. He is telling his disciples, I'm going to take up the cross. And now he's telling them, I want you to take it up. I want you to imitate me. That in some way, all of these are things which Jesus himself is doing. And so maybe there's some insight when we read them and we think, how is Jesus denying himself? How is Jesus doing these things? How is he losing his life and yet saving it? Because I think what Jesus wants us to do is imitate him, take up the cross, and follow. Now, generally, all of these seem to point to a couple things. That there's a call to find what is truly important and lasting. It seems to me in all of these, there's this assumption that there's something more significant, there's something more important and lasting, but it takes a struggle to find it. It's not easy. And that seems to be the second part. Not only is there something to be found, yourself, your own life, what is profitable in life, but it's not easy. It just doesn't fall easily into your lap. You must engage in this journey in order to secure it. So perhaps Jesus is telling us the way of the cross is not easy, but it is the way of finding ourselves, of finding the meanings of our lives, of finding how it is we are to live and find our life in him. So that seems to be something that's going on. But I particularly want us to think about this last verse, because it's the one that I think, for me, for a long time, was most disturbing, right? It was most disturbing, this whole business of, but I'll be ashamed of you. Now, I think we have a real tendency, if you were raised in kind of an evangelical church, is to read everything through the lens of eternity and that there are 2 options, heaven and hell, right? And so every text is read as somehow subtly talking to you about where you're going to spend eternity. Because the ultimate question that, as I always heard it posed, was if you were to die tonight, where would you spend eternity? Can you answer that question? Do you have confidence? Well, when we choose that as the lens for reading, then we have to read this passage as, if you're ashamed of me, you will be lost. Me being ashamed of you means I cast you away into eternal torment. Right? Because we've already decided that's the dominant theme running through everything. And so this passage has to be talking about eternal condemnation. Question is it? What does it mean? Is it a reference to eternity and where you will spend it? And Jesus, like saying, depart from me, I never knew you, pulling another passage from another thing, that again we've made about damnation, hell. I'm not so sure it is. Here's some of my thoughts. The way I had tended to understand this last passage is that when Jesus is talking about being ashamed, that the way to not be ashamed of Jesus is to tell others about him, right? The solution here is to be evangelistic. And if you're evangelistic, then you're not ashamed of Jesus and he will welcome you into heaven. I actually heard it said, because I was in circles where evangelism was very important, I remember it being said, you can't go to heaven unless you take someone with you. Like if you don't get out there and evangelize, you won't make it. Boy, does that put the pressure on, right? How many people are feeling like, I don't know if I've really evangelized anybody. I mean, I've told some people, but nobody's like responded to the message. And does it count? Like, I got to take them with me. So if nobody, quote unquote, gets converted because I told them, then maybe I miss out on heaven. Right? And verses like this maybe were some of the places those ideas came from. You haven't evangelized, you will get rejected. I'm very suspicious of preaching that is self-serving. I'm very suspicious of people in my position who are giving interpretations that somehow benefit them, right? Because most preachers want the church to make sure you attend and to make sure you give and to make sure you minister and work in our programs and to make sure you are active salespeople bringing in more customers, right? I mean, it's to my advantage if you're all doing that. And so when I read scripture and interpret it in a way that kind of puts the screws on you, tightens it down, you need to be attending, you need to be giving, you need to be evangelizing. I'm sorry, I'm very suspicious it's self-serving. So I'm doubtful that that's really what it's about. So what could this be about? The word here for ashamed, I think we're more used to using it with reference to ourselves. Like we know what it's like for us to be ashamed, right? If I really do something embarrassing, if I do something wrong and other people go, you did that wrong, I feel ashamed. I feel a sense of embarrassment and I just kind of want to crawl under the covers and nobody to know. I feel bad. It's easy to know what ashamed means with regards to myself, but what does it mean with regards to Jesus? And so I was looking at the word and actually one of the definitions said to consider a person or cause dubious. Now, dubious is maybe not the most common of words, but in other words, it's to have questions and doubts about the validity of another person or the cause that they stand for. Like if you're like, I don't know, then that's, as it were, that's the meaning of this Greek word, is to be ashamed of them. It's not like you're going to say, I heartily endorse that person. I say, yes, this is good. To be ashamed is to go, I don't know. It looks kind of doubtful, uncertain to me. I wouldn't recommend it. So what is Jesus saying? He's saying, if you are doubtful about me, then what am I going to be thoroughly in favor of who you've been? Well, I think it's pretty obvious that he'd say, well, no, I'm going to have the same doubts about you because you have had doubts about me. So what does it mean if it doesn't mean necessarily evangelism? How then do I show that I am not ashamed of Christ if it doesn't necessarily mean I go out and have to tell others, which is not a bad thing to do by any means. I've done a lot of that in my life, some of it very poorly. Some of it I'm more satisfied was done well, right? Some of it I'm ashamed about how I did that, right? My sense from the passage is the way to not be ashamed of Christ is to take up the cross. Because it strikes me that the cross itself is an object of shame. I mean, literally, the cross was. And Jesus knows that, and that's part of why Peter says no to this whole business of you're going to die, as one rejected by the authorities, as a heretic, as one outside orthodoxy. So there's something shameful in all of that. And it seems to me that there's this kind of synergy to the whole passage where it's about taking up the cross, and then it ends with, don't be ashamed. In other words, it sounds to me like don't be ashamed to bear the shame, right? Because when you take up the cross, when you live in these types of ways, yeah, other people may be doubtful about you. Why would you do such a thing? But you're not ashamed, as Paul will say in Romans, I'm not ashamed of the gospel, for it's the power of God for rescue, for healing, for salvation. So my sense is if we don't want to be ashamed of Christ, then take up the cross. Then go ahead and embrace this denial of self and following him. Go ahead and embrace this perhaps not popular or well thought of way of living your life that's open to criticism and others to doubt. To not be ashamed of Christ is to take up the cross. And perhaps, as I said about the definition of the cross, to take up the cross is to not be ashamed to live according to love in the face of hate, to the extent that it might cost you everything. I mean, if that's the core of what it means to take up the cross, then I take up the cross when I love in a ridiculous manner. I love recklessly. I love when it's ill-advised to love. I don't know that you should love that person. I'm going to do it anyway, right? Now, that's the meaning of prodigal, right? We talk about the prodigal son. A lot of times we don't know what prodigal means. Wayward? Prodigal really is, the core meaning is reckless. And people have pointed out it's not the son who's really reckless, it's the father who's the reckless one. It's the parable of the prodigal father. Who's really reckless? The father for loving the son, for not chastising the son, for not saying, well, maybe you can come back if you prove yourself first. The father is reckless, absolutely reckless in how he loves this wayward son. Taking up the cross, I think, has something to do with being willing to be that reckless. To do what is uncommon, to do what ironically may seem unwise, which on a morning when we've read from Proverbs seems a little bit in tension, right? But that's the question. What is true wisdom? It's not always the wisest thing to protect myself and to be careful about my own situation, my own security. It may actually be the wisest thing to be a little reckless, loving extravagantly. Maybe that's taking up the cross. Maybe that's not being ashamed of Christ. And then he, of course, will be pleased that I took the attempt to take up the cross and to follow him. Maybe that is what we can do by the Spirit and God's grace.